Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Hey folks, this is Docs from 2024, here to explain why we're re-uploading this episode. Due to a somewhat embarrassing editing error in the original version, the one that went up did not have my audio. We still have all the assets used to create the episode originally, so we can easily fix this. This episode was originally recorded in April of 2022, not long after Wynne Allen Bruce self-immolated in an attempt to spur action to stop climate collapse. Between now and then, Aaron Bushnell also self-immolated, in his case to spur action to prevent the genocide happening in Gaza right now. Everything we said about Mr. Bruce, we also say for Mr. Bushnell. We see you, we hear you. Good luck in the next life. Free Palestine.
Here, what is that monk doing? He has set himself on fire, yet he sits so calmly and peacefully, you would never know he's burning.
Is that not the ideal of concentration and mindfulness? The reality of samsara embodied? We're all on fire, and yet he's peaceful with it.
Why is there a crowd gathering around him and watching this?
That man is giving his life to a cause. In the grandest act of selflessness, he has sacrificed his current body so that people might feel, change, understand, and hope for some sort of change.
There is indeed great need for change at times like these. Samsara has rarely felt more samsaric than now.
That is why he gives his body. We must give the most in the times and places when and where the suffering of sentient beings is the most.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be departing from the regular programming schedule, what we announced we would be saying last week. And in light of the recent news of a protester self-immolating in front of the Supreme Court in the U.S., we have decided to dedicate an episode to self-immolation. What is it? Why do people do it? And what are some examples of self-immolation in Buddhist scriptural texts? So, what is self-immolation?
I think that the image that we're all familiar with for this concept is lighting oneself on fire in some sort of protest. However, the definition is actually much broader than that in the Buddhist context. According to the Encyclopedia of Buddhism edited by Robert Buswell, self-immolation is any act of voluntary termination of life or offering of parts of the body. It just so happens that the most common form it takes is auto-cremation, or lighting oneself on fire. And we will talk about the reasons why that's the case in a moment. Other common forms, however, include burning off one's fingers, burning one's head with incense, letting bugs and animals eat parts of the body, and more. Anything that can be thought of as abandoning or giving up the body as a gift to others counts as self-immolation in the Buddhist context. It is a category under which all of these various forms of bodily destruction fall. Self-immolation can be found in nearly all strata of Buddhism, and in East and South Asia, different forms of self-immolation have become popular in different places for different reasons. For example, upon Buddhism's entry to China, self-immolation as auto-cremation was strongly looked down upon because of the popularity of Confucianism. Confucianism holds that this body that you have is a gift from your parents, and to destroy it, in all ways to burn it, is impious to them and to all of the rest of your ancestors. The Buddhist response, however, is that self-immolation is giving the body to the whole universe, not just to one's parents. It's an act of generosity that goes beyond simply the individual family. The most notable examples in the popular imagination are the Vietnamese monks who auto-cremated themselves between 1963 and 1975 to protest the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Self-immolation among Vietnamese monks is reported to actually have continued for various reasons as recently as the early 2000s. Additionally, Tibetans have been known to self-immolate as a protest against the Chinese occupation and as a response to the Chinese invading their country in the 1950s, as a response to the Chinese slaughtering the Tibetan people and continuing to control and marginalize and subjugate them. Most recently, on Earth Day 2022, a Colorado man known to be a Buddhist and a climate activist immolated himself on the steps of the Supreme Court as a protest against current climate policy.
So a couple of things to note at this point. So I've always heard the word immolate to mean light on fire, but when I actually looked up the definition in preparation for this episode, the dictionary lists that it could also just mean to sacrifice. So the word immolate does not necessarily automatically mean fire. The other thing I will note on this is that if a given listener wants to look more up about this, be aware there are pictures of self-cremation up online. They are quite a thing to see. So if you're going to go looking for this yourself, understand what you're getting yourself into.
Yes, content warnings all around. This is not a pretty practice. It's quite gory and quite visually disturbing. And so be careful as you're looking it up.
So, why do people self-immolate?
So the most common theme here in this practice of self-immolation is that it's thought of as a compassionate practice and has become popular among Mahayana Buddhists who are seeking the Bodhisattva path. Bodhisattvas, as we have discussed, are trying to achieve true selflessness. That means that they are trying to be generous, compassionate, and merciful toward all sentient beings without a single thought of self, of other, of good, of bad, etc., etc. To think that way would be to fail miserably at the Bodhisattva ideal. The reason it would be such a failure is that the grander Buddhist ideal is to abandon all ideas of self and to be generous, compassionate, merciful, etc. And instead of doing those things instrumentally for one's own benefit, you want to do it because you don't believe there is a self to be benefited, and because you recognize that over the course of infinite rebirths, everyone has been your family members, everyone has been your friends, all sentient beings have always been in all positions of relationship, and so you have more than enough reason to be selfless and giving and generous and compassionate to them. So you don't want to believe that there is a self that can be benefited. The Bodhisattva ideal is also to believe that the reason you do good is not to attain good rebirths. That's an instrumental way of looking at it, and that's not what they strive for. To that end, offering the body has come to be seen as a way to truly transcend the attachment to self, to having a soul, or to mistaking the body for being capital S self. When you self-immolate, that is the greatest act of giving that you can possibly do. There is nothing more precious that someone could give than their life or their body. There is a famous example in the Jataka tales of the Buddha giving up his life to feed a hungry tigers. The Jataka tales are stories that are collected of the Buddha telling stories of his past lives, previous reincarnations where he was doing the work necessary to become a Buddha in the life that he became a Buddha in. In this story, there was a tigress who was starving, and this prince who was striving for the Bodhisattva ideal went into the forest and met this tigress. And this tigress was about to eat her young, and instead of having the tigress eat her young in order to survive, he gave his own life so that she could be fed. Additionally, people have done self-immolation in medieval China as a means of devotion to certain texts and traditions, and people in Japan in the Pure Land schools have done it as a way to achieve rebirth in the Pure Land, so there's a lot of contexts for this practice. Religious suicide in this Buddhist context allows one to have their moment of death be mindful and under their control, and self-immolation is the grandest act of giving that one can do. And so in that regard, those who are concerned with the moment of death, like Pure Land Buddhists in Japan, like to do this sort of practice because it gives you that much control and it purifies that much good karma right at the very last moment. Additionally, there are examples of self-immolation as an act of devotion to the Lotus Sutra. To give one's own body as an offering to the teaching of the sutra is instructed by the sutra itself in certain places, and it's said in the sutra to accrue great merit, great good karma. Lately, as in the last 100 years, self-immolation has become a form of protest. One reason is that self-immolation is harmless to others, yet it achieves the ideal of giving the body, and it's very striking. It makes people feel something very strongly. And it's a gift of the body to the resolution of the cause and to the quote-unquote greater good, if such a thing can be said to exist. Thich Nhat Hanh refers to self-immolation not as destruction, but as construction, as one is suffering and dying for the sake of one's people. In that regard, the gift given by self-immolation has changed from sustenance, like in the Jataka tales, to being the gift of a message or of meaning, like in the case of these recent protests.
So, for the religious context, I'm not going to say, anything one way or the other about the efficacy of self-immolation, but in the protest sense, I think that this is a counterproductive action. Because anybody who is hardcore enough to voluntarily set themselves on fire for a cause is probably hardcore enough to keep fighting for that cause and doing good while they're alive. And also, it does not seem to actually work to get attention. The monks who have self-immolated as a protest moment in Tibet have not achieved their goals. Tibet is still under the heel of China really hard right now. The gentleman who self-immolated himself on Earth Day, most of the headlines about that did not even mention his climate activism. He did not get what he wanted in a real world sense from this act. Now, he may have gotten exactly what he wanted religiously, and I respect that completely. But I also feel like we've lost the potentially really useful climate activists through this action.
That's a good critique to have. And it shines light on the fact that this self-immolation is inseparable as a religious act and a protest. So I would argue that there is more to it in the religious sense that includes the protest sense that makes it such that you can't really separate the two. I agree that if someone is dedicated enough to a cause such that they would set themselves on fire for it, then it's kind of a waste to end their lives early and not contribute to the cause. But I think that there is such a strong religious efficacy and it strikes such a note with other people in that religion. And I also think that it's such an attention-grabbing event that in that regard, it does have limited efficacy for maybe raising awareness, maybe for making someone somewhere change their minds about something. Now, what's most important about that is also what's most important about protesting is that it must be witnessed. In the case of the person who immolated themselves on the steps of the Supreme Court, there are no photos circulating around. As soon as the person set themselves on fire, the emergency services rushed in because it's the Supreme Court. They were there waiting. There's people who wait at the Supreme Court for bad things to happen. And they zoomed to the scene and immediately tried to put him out, tried to take him to the hospital, etc. And we didn't get the benefit of the very striking photograph that we have of monks in Vietnam who were protesting the Vietnam War. And a little bit of the impact of the action is lost in a real world sense by us not having that. I think that seeing the monk immolate themselves fueled the anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States and changed some minds to see that what was actually going on in Vietnam, dropping napalm on Vietnamese people in a losing war against this scary, nebulous, mercurial idea that is communism. They started to see that that's what was really happening. People were on fire, right? It was so striking and it was so prosaic and poetic in the moment that it really had a strong impact. And since then, like you say, in Tibet or on the steps of the Supreme Court, or even lately in Vietnam, a lot of that is missed. And it's a shame that it's missed. But at the same time, I think that we can feel less shame that it's missed in the real world sense because it never is missed in the religious sense. It's never missed in the sense that these people and the religious community around them believed and currently believe that they achieved their goal by flying colors. You know what I mean? So whenever people in the past have written the Lotus Sutra, they've copied the Lotus Sutra in their own blood, like we'll discuss in a minute here, you can often say, well, I have a pen. And that kind of brings you back to the real world sense, but it takes away from the religious sense a little bit. So we shouldn't forget the fact that there is kind of a religious efficacy to this that unfortunately is not directed straight at the protest cause, is often directed straight at some sort of doctrine.
Right. This is a difficult idea to evaluate because of the way it mixes the real-world implications of the protests and the religious ideas of self-sacrifice. The latter is always going to be powerful.
And uncontestable.
Yes, it's a big deal in that sense. But we also, this is me coming at this from a non-religious sense, we have to be tactical about how we approach protests and how we approach resistance to oppression. And from a tactical sense, this is a losing move.
I agree that if we're talking about instrumentally pulling down whatever establishment the protest is directed against, then taking out your own soldiers, so to speak, is not really a good idea. However, if I were to sit in a Buddhist's shoes and do my very best to argue from their perspective as much as I can as a white male person from the West who has only been studying and practicing Buddhism for a few years now, what I would say then is that, well, those who have survived, who have not immolated themselves, how much progress have they made compared to how much progress the person who immolated themselves made? And the answer, in terms of maybe Tibet gaining autonomous sovereign state status, not a lot of progress. Or in the case of Vietnam, well, the monk who immolated himself in protest of that didn't really make a lot of progress either. And neither did all the anti-war protesters in the United States in the 1960s. And then on it goes, including this Earth Day protester and everyone who's been protesting for climate policy. They kind of haven't made a lot of progress. And so I think that in that regard, the self-immolation becomes a symbol for the fact that samsara is a losing battle. Samsara itself is a losing battle. If you try and take away the suffering of samsara, you can't, because that would be fundamentally redefining what samsara means, what it is by definition, what the realm is marked by. There's an axiom in Buddhism that says that all conditioned dharmas are marked by defilement. Now, this is a contentious thing. There's plenty of schools who agree and disagree for different reasons and have different modifications on that. But the definition is that anything in reality that's subject to impermanence and emptiness, which is everything in reality, it's all marked by or has the characteristic of defilement, meaning that it undergoes suffering, it contributes to suffering, it participates in suffering. It's samsaric. It's marked by defilement is basically saying it's samsaric. And in that regard, yeah, everything is that way. And so immolating oneself doesn't change that any more than staying alive and protesting until your face turns blue. And so in that regard, if I were to sit in the Buddhist's shoes, I would say to myself, these both seem equally valid in both directions because they both kind of make the same amount of progress.
My response to that, I think, would be that kind of thinking is part of why Buddhism is often portrayed as a nihilistic religion, because that is one of the most cynical things I've ever heard.
Well, I agree that it makes it sound cynical and nihilistic, but I would also say that just because samsara is a losing battle doesn't mean that we should stop trying. That's why there is a bodhisattva ideal in the first place. Mahayana Buddhism, valuing this bodhisattva ideal, or this Buddhahood ideal, is emphasizing saving all sentient beings and remedying the suffering of all sentient beings. And so it's acknowledging the fact that samsara is samsara. But out of 100% suffering, we can remedy up to a certain number, a certain proportion of suffering. And that's the ideal we should strive for. Because if we do the opposite, we're making the problem worse, or we're doing something that will cause us to have a bad rebirth, or we are doing something that would cause other people to be prevented from a good rebirth. And so because the situation is so bad, that has turned into the actual cause for why we should try and make the situation better. Now, it's just understanding that there are limits to that. Under the weight, you might say, or under the reality of emptiness and impermanence and suffering, there is only so much we can do, but we should do everything we can.
That's fair. This is a point where it's just the way I try to think and act tactically, and so that's just a different approach to life, I suppose. let's get back to the script and what we came here to talk about. So, what are some examples of self-immolation in the Buddhist scriptural texts?
So there is a lot of scriptural precedent for self-immolation. The earliest, like I mentioned, is the Jataka tales. I mentioned that those are tales of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni's previous lives as he worked to become an arhat, and then a bodhisattva, and then a Buddha. We talked about the hungry tigress and how he fed his body to the tigress to prevent her from having to eat her young or starve to death. And that is regarded as a very high level, very positive act of selflessness. Self-immolation comes up in some of the other sutras as well. In the Lotus Sutra, for example, there's a case in chapter 23 where the bodhisattva Vaisajaguru, or Medicine King, immolates himself in a previous life in order to bring light to a bunch of worlds or universes that have gone dark. And he's also doing this in order to make an offering to the Buddha, which is one of the 3 things that has to happen in order for you to become a Buddha in a future life. In that same chapter, offering parts of the body to the Lotus Sutra is often said to bring great merit. To that end, as we've talked about, one practice is that people have copied the Lotus Sutra in their own blood, which they think is creating a karmic connection between themselves and the Lotus Sutra, breaking down the distinction between themselves and the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and thereby realizing it and embodying it in real life. And it's also as an act of an offering to the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. Others have removed or burned part or all of themselves as offerings to the Lotus Sutra. And in Japan, self-immolation became popular in some sects of Pure Land school of Buddhism. This was done as a religious suicide aimed at attaining rebirth in the Pure Land. These suicides in Japan often took the form of not auto-cremation, but actually of drowning oneself. Recently, the way that these immolations have become protests is that, as I said, the gift given has changed from just being the body as sustenance to being a message or a meaning or an impact of some kind. The way that this has happened actually is that in the Lotus Sutra, Medicine King's self-immolation was witnessed, and all other acts of devotion to the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, or actually to the text itself, the book that you're holding, all of these are meant to be witnessed by others because the Lotus Sutra and other sutras in Mahayana Buddhism are strongly concerned with offering validity to themselves. And one of the ways that they do that is by instructing the reader, the devotee, to go and show their reverence, respect, worthiness for the sutra, for the text, and go and show that in some ritual act while others are watching. That is the doctrine of merit transfer. The merit transfer is that you do something very good around other people, and you get a lot of good karma and merit for doing it around other people, and they get a lot of good karma and merit for seeing it. And in that regard, you can cause the awakening of other people by this witnessing. Additionally, like I've said, real-world protests also need to be witnessed. So you have to see what people are protesting about or see the protest itself in order for the protest to have any sort of impact. If I were sitting in my home and I was just alone and had no TV and I was cut off from the outside world, but everyone else in the entire state was out in the streets protesting something, I wouldn't know about it. And I wouldn't know why they were protesting or why that issue was important. And therefore, the protest and the issue would both be lost on me. And in that regard, protests have to be seen. To that end, self-immolation and its necessity for being witnessed, as prescribed by the Lotus Sutra and by other sutras, has then become a sort of way to send a message to others. That's how the gift changed from being the actual flesh that you can eat to being the message and the impact that you can understand.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode on self-immolation. Join us next week, where we will be returning to our regularly scheduled programming and discussing Samantabhadra, who is known in Chinese as Puajian or in Japanese as Fugen. Who is he? What are some stories about him? What sort of devotional texts and rituals are there for him? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
This episode is dedicated to Wen Bruce and his message. Wen, we see you, we hear you, and we thank you for this message. The climate crisis is the single greatest threat to sentient beings everywhere, and we must do something to help heal this world we live on. Thank you, Wen. We wish you all the best in the next life.